Now.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear excellencies, it's our great pleasure to welcome you to this expert discussion on the free and open Indo-Pacific perspectives from Japan and Austria, as well as Europe. We are happy to organize this online expert discussion from the side of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in cooperation with the Japanese Embassy here in Vienna, Austria. My name is Michael ZINKANELL. I'm the Deputy Director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion and to thank the Japanese Embassy and especially Ambassador MIZUTANI for co-organizing and co-hosting this event. It's actually the second event that we're doing together, so thank you very much for this kind cooperation. We at the AIES follow, of course, the internal European developments in the field of security, defense, and foreign policy, but also carefully analyze and take a look at the most pressing geostrategic developments. And clearly, the Indo-Pacific region is such a field due to its size, due to its importance, due to the fact that it's home to almost half the world's population, producing roughly 40% of the global GDP, and geographically reaching from Nairobi, Kenya to the United States West Coast. The importance on a global political, economic, and security level of the Indo-Pacific region cannot be neglected, and it's crucial to the importance of the European Union, to its geostrategic ambitions, and it is also manifested in the most recent European document, the EU Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which was just published 2 months ago. We're here today to discuss the most important issues regarding the security, regarding the developments of the Indo-Pacific. And I'm happy to announce that we will start this presentation with opening remarks from His Excellency Ambassador MIZUTANI, Ambassador to the Republic of Austria. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being with us and for sharing your opening remarks with the audience.
Thank you, Mr. ZINKANELL. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Vienna. I would like to welcome you to today's online seminar, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, Perspectives of Japan and Austria, Europe, a topic of actuality and high relevancy. The Indo-Pacific region has received worldwide attention from the economic and geopolitical point of view. In fact, the region has become the engine of growth for the world economy, comprising half of the world's population and containing essential sea lanes for maritime trade, connecting Asia, Africa, and the west coast of the United States. 1/3 of the world's total trade and 40% of Europe's foreign trade go through the South China Sea in that region. Without the Indo-Pacific region, we can't address global agenda such as sustainable supply chains, climate and environmental protection in the most effective way. At the same time, there are various challenges, including those against security matters witnessed in the East and South China Seas, and those against fundamental principles such as democracy and human rights, or deterioration of debt sustainability among developing countries. No single country can achieve peace and stability in the region by itself. And we need strong bi- and multilateral cooperation, such as through joint initiatives or sharing best practices. Against this backdrop, my embassy here in Austria and the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, AIES, are co-hosting today's lecture and panel discussion. It is timely and appropriate that experts from Japan and Europe discuss this issue and share their knowledge and experience. First, Mr. Murano, Japan Chair Fellow, Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., will explain the current situation in the Indo-Pacific from the perspective of international politics and identify the challenges. He will then comment on Japan's policy of free and open Indo-Pacific, abbreviation is FOIP, for short, and present his recommendations for maintaining peace and stability in the region. Following Mr. Murano's lecture, the renowned European expert on the Indo-Pacific, Mrs. Chakarova, Director of AIES, and Dr. SECKINGTON, Senior Principal Research Analyst of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, will take the floor. Then they discuss together with Mr. Murano about the topic, namely Indo-Pacific perspectives of Austria, Europe. Mr. ZINKANELL of AIES will moderate the discussion. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion on national approaches and finding potential areas of extended international cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, taking this opportunity, I would like to thank our co-organizer, AIES. Thank you, Dr. FASSLABEND, for their cooperation in realizing this event. I also thank the Embassy of the United Kingdom in Austria and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in London for their contributions. I do hope this seminar will also contribute to strengthening bi- and multilateral cooperation in this regard. I wish you fruitful discussion. Now, I'm very pleased to invite Mr. Murano to the screen. Mr. Murano, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind introduction. And first of all, that I would like to thank AIES and Japanese Embassy in Austria for giving me this opportunity. I'm a Masashi Murano, the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Basically, I'm responsible for U.S.-Japan defense cooperation, but also that I'm handling broader issues related on the security environment related on Japan. And as Ambassador MIZUTANI mentioned, the importance of the Indo-Pacific region is the context of global geopolitics and geoeconomics is growing enormously today. There are many opportunities abound in this rapidly developing region. These opportunities are not only for our physical neighboring countries, such as Japan and other Asian countries, but are also open to the United States, Europe, and other countries. However, in order to access these opportunities and benefits, the Indo-Pacific region needs to be more than just a geographic sphere or geographic space. It's it needs to be safe space, safe and secure and stable space, where the free and open values and principles are maintained. This means that along with the many opportunities that exist in the region, there are also risks that may cause those opportunities to be lost. So, and these risks are not unique to the Indo-Pacific region, but have cross-regional impacts and cross-regional implications. So today I'd like to talk about the risks and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific from a Japanese perspective. Could you share that my presentation slide first? Thank you very much. Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative was the first mentioned by former Prime Minister Abe in his speech in Kenya in 2016. However, its origins go back to the first term of the Abe administration, when he addressed the Parliament of India in 2007. At that time, the Prime Minister Abe mentioned that confluence of the two seas. Needless to say, the two seas here, two oceans here, refers to the Indian. One is Indian Ocean, and the second one is the Pacific Ocean. As shown in this slide, if we look at the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as a single integrated region, we can see that the region includes the two continents. One is the Asia, which is growing rapidly, and another one is Africa, which has a lot of potential. The Indo-Pacific region holds half of the world's population, and it's the engine of the global economic growth. And historically speaking, this region is familiar to Japan because of the route from the Middle East to the Indian Ocean, and then the pass through the South China Sea and Taiwan. There has been an important energy supply line since the Cold War era. At the same time, cooperation and support for ASEAN countries has been an important factor in economic development. And also, the United States, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean from Japan, has also recognized the importance of this region and has continued to work closely with Japan. For instance, during the Cold War, the United States and Japan have conducted joint studies of the sea lane defense operations. And in 2018, the U.S. Pacific Command was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. However, this importance of this region is now growing for Europe. For example, 1/3 of the world trade and 40% of Europe's foreign trade pass through the South China Sea. So I will talk a little bit more about the instability of the security environment in Asia later. But therefore, if the peace and the stability of Indo-Pacific region disturbed, all stakeholders, they are like us, will suffer many disadvantages, both politically and economically. Please, next slide. Thank you. So Japan's approaches to the realization of the free and open Indo-Pacific that consists of the three pillars and components. The first is the promotion of fundamental values and principles, which includes, for instance, rule of laws and freedom of navigations and free trade and so on. And second is the pursuit of the economic prosperity, including through the improvement of connectivities. This connectivities here includes the physical connectivity through support for the development of the quality infrastructure developments, such as ports, railways, roads, energy, and the information and the communication technologies like 5Gs. Also, the people-to-people connectivities through the human resources development. And then the institutional connectivity means the facilitating customs, among others. And also, it also includes a strengthening economic partnership, including the FTAs and EPAs and so on. And the third is ensuring the peace and the stability, which means that the security-related efforts. This includes that capacity building for regional countries, and the capacity building for the regional countries, the coast guards, and the cooperation in the area of the humanitarian assistance slash disaster relief, counter piracy, and non-proliferation activities in the region. And the Japanese government has also repeatedly stated that this concept, the FOIP concept, is neither exclusive nor opposed to any particular regional concepts and strategies. But it is a case of sharing the value and the principles of free and open. That if there are challenges, some potential challenges, who wants to make the Indo-Pacific restricted and closed region? So we must protect the rule-based security order from these challenges. So since the specific field is traditional security issues, so I would like to discuss in some more details the security challenges we faced in promoting the free and open in the Pacific. The security environment in Indo-Pacific, where the U.S. with its allies, including Japan and China, encounter each other, is sometimes described as a risky situation that could lead to an arms race. Some people see this situation as a problem of the security dilemma or Thucydides trap. However, it is not appropriate. It is not appropriate to use the discussion of security dilemmas to explain this regional security environment. From my perspective, the security dilemma is defined as the spiral model of the unexpected arms race that occurs even though no side really desires it. But it is clear that China's military expansion and their activities over the past 20 years are not reaction to Japan's defense posture and strategy. From the late 1990s to 2012, Japan's defense budget was almost flat or even declining. And since 2012, following the inauguration of the second Abe administration, Japan's defense budget has grown. But this growth rate is about just 1% a year, and it is the marginal compared to Chinese defense spending growth, which for FY 2020 increased by 5.2% over the previous years. In addition, before the COVID-19 pandemic, the diplomatic relations between Japan and China were on an improving trend with a state visit by President Xi Jinping scheduled for the spring of 2020. However, at this moment, Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese Navy vessels has been increasing active in East China Sea. In other words, even if diplomatic relations between Japan and China improve, the China's military and paramilitary activities, they have become more active. And please go to the next slide. Thank you. Let's look at a few more specific examples. The first, the size of the Chinese Coast Guard is already more than double than the Japanese Coast Guard. And second, the sum of Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been converted from PLA, Chinese Navy frigates. And so they are superior to the Japanese Coast Guard patrol vessels in terms of the firepower and protection capabilities. And third, as China are doing is in the South China Sea, Chinese Coast Guard vessels are chasing Japanese fishing boats around in Japan's territorial waters. So this is one of the indicators that how many the Chinese government vessels entering the Japan's continuous zone or into the territorial water surrounding the Senkaku Island in the East China Sea. So nevertheless to say that Chinese Coast Guard has become the largest presence of maritime law enforcement agencies in this region. And behind these actions the objective of China to assert its own sovereignty by undermining the administrative control and other countries' administrative controls. So these activities are not innocent passage as allowed by the international law. So, and Chinese Coast Guard law, which was implemented in this February, gives that the Chinese Coast Guard the authorities to deviate from the scope of the UNCLOS and set to the ambiguous standards for the use of force and excessive overclaim. And in other words, Chinese Coast Guard law is one of the evidence of China's willingness to use of force in the order to change the status quo in this region, especially in the Southeast China Sea and South China Sea, by gray zone tactics. As we already know that this methodological assertion of sovereignties is not only happening in Asia. So just last week, the UK Royal Navy destroyers navigating innocently in the Black Sea, the south of Crimean Peninsula, to be exact, they received a warning from Russian military and paramilitary forces. So they not only claimed that they illegally occupied the territorial waters of Crimea, but also tried to disrupt the Royal Navy destroyers' innocent passage. To be honest, I am not sure if these actions were intentionally coordinated or strategic collaboration between China and Russia. But I can say that, but Russian behavior is in the maritime domain in Europe. It's beginning to resemble Chinese behavior in Indo-Pacific. This is not a good trend for us. So please remember what I said earlier. A security dilemma is an unanticipated escalation spiral model of military expansion. So, but this unstable situation that we are experiencing is in the Pacific region is not unexpected arms race spiral like security dilemma. That if China's military buildup is not a reaction to the action of the US-Japan alliance, that no matter how much diplomatic communication improves, that there will be the fundamentally competitive relationship between US-Japan alliance and China. So during the peacetime of the gray zone, the Japanese Coast Guard and Japanese self-defense forces must conduct presence patrols to dynamically deter the Chinese opportunistic expansion. However, when considering the seamless escalation control from low-intensity aggression and to the high-intensity conflicts for the presence to address Chinese anti-access area denial threats, needed to be deployed by the distributed manner. These competing operational demands are complicated how to combine the best mix of the defense posture and the portfolio directions. And the Japanese defense community has been tackled on this difficult problem of how to figure out the most appropriate solution to this competing demand since around 2010. But to be honest, the complex nature of this problem has not been seriously understood in the West countries, to be honest. However, that situation changed after the Crimea crisis in 2014. As we realized that at that time, gray zone or hybrid warfare were not confined to be the gray zone or the pre-war level alone. The challengers, they believe they can better compete at the gray zone level by casting the conventional or nuclear shadow. So therefore, our counter-escalation strategy needs to be considered as the integrated ones from the gray zone to the conventional and nuclear level. So in addition, allies and partners need to discuss in advance the various operational scenarios and the policy decision making, such as whether it is better to maintain the ambiguity to complicate Chinese calculation, or to draw a clear red line and sending a clear deterrent signal. If this trend continues, the Japanese Coast Guard will eventually be overwhelmed and saturated by Chinese Coast Guard. And if this situation happens, Japan may be forced to deploy the maritime self-defense forces first. So even if this situation happens, I hope that international community will understand that Japan has not taken any illegal aggressive actions. And China is deliberately keeping the confrontation at the gray zone level, because if it gets into the conventional level conflict with Japan, it will trigger the U.S. military intervention under the Article 5 of U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So if so, then the calculated messaging, the risk of potential escalation on the part of U.S. and Japan may be necessary to restrain Chinese gray zone aggressions. So for this to happen, Japan needs the international community to support us as a status quo power that's standing together. So after this panel discussion sessions, I'm looking forward to discussing further about these kind of topics to share our knowledge of each experience for the both region. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, arigato gozaimasu, Mr. Murano, for your very elaborate presentation, for setting the scene perfectly for the discussion that is about to follow. Thank you very much at this stage also to Mr. Ambassador MIZUTANI for your opening remarks. I think we have now clearly defined the issues that are at stake in the region, explaining especially the principles, the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy from Japan, stressing the importance for the Indo-Pacific region, not only from the Japanese perspective, but also introducing why it is important for the European Union and for also the security, the trade, the political developments that affect the European Union, and for addressing the elephant in the room, if you might say so, the issue regarding Chinese vessels in the region and also the security challenges that these new developments poses. It is my great pleasure to introduce now our panelists for the discussion that we're anticipating, which will last for approximately an hour, before we open also the room for questions from the audience. Before I introduce our speakers, I would just like to use the opportunity to make a small remark to all our viewers. You can use the YouTube chat function to pose questions to our speakers. I will take a look at the chat and I will address some of the questions in the discussion later. So please feel free if you want to ask some questions to our established and distinguished speakers. And I also have an information that the Japanese embassy here in Austria has asked our viewers to fill in a small survey regarding this event. This information will be shared with our viewers on the chat also from the YouTube channel. And we also have the information on the UK's integrated review that will be discussed also during the presentation. We will post the link for everyone who is interested also in the comment section of YouTube. So it is my great honor, and without further ado, to introduce our guests for the next discussion. First and foremost, Velina Chakarova, the director at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy here in Vienna. Velina's analysis and consulting activities involve the global system transformation and geostrategic challenges and developments of all global actors. And she has, of course, recently also been analyzing and publishing on the wider region of the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much, Velina, for being with us. Then we have our next speaker, who is Dr. Ian Shackington. Unfortunately, Mr. Shackington's video is not working, but he will be able to speak and also share his input with us. He is a senior principal research analyst at the Foreign Asian Pacific Research Group at the Commonwealth and Development's Office, Richard Carter. He served also in the British Embassy in Beijing and Tokyo prior to his current position. Thank you very much, Dr. Shackington, for being with us. And last but not least, we also have with us to discuss later also the Japanese perspective and give us also his perspectives on the discussion that follows from Mr. Murano. He was already introduced, but allow me to reintroduce him again. He is the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. His research areas include U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation and nuclear and conventional deterrence analysis. Thank you very much for being with us. After the discussion, we will also have the honor to have some final remarks by Dr. Werner FASSLABEND, the former Austrian Minister of Defense and also president at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. However, first of all, I would like to hand over the floor to our director, Ms. Velina Chakarova, for her first remarks and to introduce the panel discussion Indo-Pacific perspectives from Austria and Europe.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, dear gentlemen and dear guests who are watching us in the live stream. It's a great pleasure to participate in this public discussion. And I would like to introduce very shortly the European approach towards the Indo-Pacific, to present you the key features, the way how Europeans And let me remind you that when we talk about the European approach, it is a twofold process entailing institutions and European members. And then moving from there, I would like also to give you an idea about the Austrian contribution. By far, this has been the most active, most dynamic year when it comes to the European approach toward this Indo-Pacific region. Both institutions and member states have been very active. And I would like to start with a quote by our European Union top diplomat Borrell, who actually said that the Indo-Pacific region is where geopolitics and geoeconomics meet. And I absolutely agree with this statement by claiming that we are going to witness the Indo-Pacific decade. So we are actually not just in the middle of a systemic rivalry between the United States and China, but we are also witnessing the emergence of an Indo-Pacific decade where the gravity of power shift is going to be witnessed to the greatest extent in this region. Surely also because of the fact that not only China, the systemic rival to the United States is positioned there and is actually looking for an increased access to the Indian Ocean, but also because India is on its path to becoming a third economic power in the next decade. So actually, these are two main trading partners for the European Union, together with the United States and Japan. You see how important this region is actually for Europe. And of course, the institutions and the member states did their homework. On the one side, there have been extensive efforts towards presenting, creating, launching the first strategic document. So several member states introduced their strategies and guiding lines towards the Indo-Pacific, including France, which is of course no surprise, as France is of course the most present European member in the region. But next to it also Germany, the Netherlands, and now most recently UK. So this is the one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, also the European Union, together as a group of 27 member states, presented a strategy on the Indo-Pacific, which is of course another unique approach, and that shows already kind of readiness to engage more actively with the region. And finally, a key milestone was also witnessed with the European Union India Summit this May, which agreed on the relaunch of a FTA, a free trade agreement with India, which was put on hold in 2013. So all of these actions come to show that now all actors on the European continent are pulling in the same direction. So that is the first message I have for you. The second, and as my colleague already outlined, there are a lot of points of intersection, a lot of fields where actually Europeans can find a common ground together with their Asian partners, but they need to be more active. So we have the political will on the one side. The second would be, of course, to identify concrete fields and concrete common ground. So one, of course, would be security and defense. And here, once again, the European Union will seek to protect the critical maritime routes and supply chains, as we know that a majority of these critical maritime routes and supply chains are in the Indo-Pacific region. Second, it will seek also to organize and participate in joint exercises and port calls between the Indo-Pacific naval units and the European Union counter-piracy naval force operations, Atlanta. Once again, we are observing very closely what is already going on in the Indo-Pacific, and my anticipation is that the European member states will actually seek to actively participate in such kind of exercises in the future. And of course, the European Union will also encourage increased participation of partners in the so-called European Union military and civilian common security and defense policy missions. Once again, we understand that we need to contribute more. So next to trade, of course, we as the largest common market, of course, will further seek to promote trade investment relations. But I wanted to stress the point of security and defense because this will be another major point, major area for cooperation in the future, because the stability of the Indo-Pacific matters not just for the Asian partners, but also for us, for the European Union. And what would this mean from an Austrian perspective? Of course, Austria is going to have an intellectual exchange and serious debate also on its role on the Indo-Pacific. Austria has been, in fact, engaged in the Indo-Pacific region in numerous areas along the lines of the European Union's areas of activities. In addition to well-established strategic partnerships with several important Asian countries, China, India, Japan, South Korea, to name just a few. The European Union, under the Austrian presidency in 2018, has adopted the so-called European Union Asia connectivity strategy to bring the two continents closer together. So it was more or less an initiative that the Austrian presidency prepared and pushed forward. And this strategy focuses on sustainable, comprehensive and rules-based connectivity, as well as local benefits and ownership. Connectivity is a major issue, for instance, for the relations between the European Union and Japan. So it will be also a major issue for the upcoming negotiations between the European Union and India. So connectivity is going to be this key word where both continents have certainly a lot in common. Asia and Europe also exchange ideas through the so-called informal Asia-Europe meeting, dialogue and cooperation process, in which, meanwhile, 53 participants, 53 countries and organizations are participating. And here, too, ASEAN is, of course, a key player. So the European Union and the member states will be very much pushing towards ASEAN centrality. And we know also why, because there have been other regional organizations and formats being pushed by, for instance, by China, where, for instance, the European Union is not a partner, but also, of course, it is in our interest that we promote inclusivity of multilateral organizations. So Austria's trade and investment with Southeast Asia is going to grow significantly. This is our expectation. We have many central players in this part of the world. So the expectation is also that at some point, probably next year, we are going to initiate debate on the possibility of having an own Indo-Pacific paper or guiding line. The Dutch and the German Indo-Pacific strategies are particularly relevant for our Austrian interests at the moment. So we are closely observing, of course, all relevant papers and documents. And of course, we are very much interested also in the German position derived from the guidelines on the Indo-Pacific. So my anticipation is that Austria will also adopt a strategic approach, especially from the Asian Indo-Pacific strategies that have also been developed in the recent years. Also, of course, our approach is that very much related and linked to the European Union institutional approach when it comes to the relations with China. That means we look at China not just as an institutional partner, but also as an economic competitor and as a systemic rival. That means, of course, that we need the kind of hedging strategy. So for us to boost and promote and develop the relations with our Indo-Pacific partners, this would be a very good hedging strategy used, for example, already by Southeast Asian countries, where on the one side we can draw on certain economic advantages in the relations with China, but on the other side we can also boost and promote relations with the rest of the Indo-Pacific. And at the same time, close economic relations with these other states will prevent certain dependencies from dependencies on China. And at the other side, on the other side, close political and security cooperation with the Indo-Pacific countries, specifically with, of course, Japan, with India, and at the background, of course, the United States, which sits itself, of course, also at the forefront of this Indo-Pacific region. We should actually help and promote reducing possible security risks and threats in the future. So from Austria's point of view, confrontational measures are and should be predominantly taken by the European Union level. So to use a very famous quote by Mr. FASSLABEND, who has been pushing for this approach, and I very much agree with it. So we should actually stick to the European Union as the bad cop, and in that sense, Austria and other middle-sized countries should be more in the role of the good cop when it comes to the relations with the Indo-Pacific, specifically when it comes to navigating carefully between China on the one side, which is going to further rise, but then again, the Indo-Pacific countries that, of course, are increasingly worried because of this rise. So to sum up, for Austria as a neutral country, which is clearly anchored in liberal democratic and free market values, the maintenance of this existing Western-based international order, so rules-based order, which is very much reflected also in this concept, in this construct of the free and open Indo-Pacific. It will be of great significance to actually be more involved, more active, and promote exactly that this kind of norms, rules, and standards with like-minded partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Velina Chakarova, for these very precise words that you have found to describe the importance of the Indo-Pacific region and also the most recent strategic developments on the level of the European Union versus and against the national strategies that you have pointed out, which have been developed recently also by single European member states. And also thank you for pointing out the importance of the entire region on a multitude of areas and levels for Austria as well, because probably at first glance this is not as obvious to some of our viewers why the Indo-Pacific region is also of crucial importance to Austria. Moving on from the European Union to probably one other perspective that is still within the realm of the European, but not the European Union perspective, moving to the UK's perspective. I'd like to introduce again Dr. Ian SECKINGTON. Thank you very much for being with us and for giving us also a detailed overview on the UK's integrated review and the importance of the Indo-Pacific to the UK, plus the strategies that have been developed most recently also by the United Kingdom I would like to hand over the floor now to you, Mr. Seckington, and thank you very much for your remarks.
Thank you, Michael. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. If you can just speak just slightly louder, I think that would be wonderful.
Good, lovely. I'll speak up then. And apologies for not being able to join by camera. My IT today is playing up a little bit. I'd like to add my thanks to AIES and to the Embassy of Japan for the kind invitation today to join this session. It's been fascinating to hear the presentation so far, and indeed to re-engage on FOIP and some of the issues surrounding the free and open Indo-Pacific. It was very much the central theme to my tour in the British Embassy in Tokyo over the last 4 years. What I thought I'd do, and I think I have the much easier task compared to Velina, is just to focus on one country, my own country, and just to outline a little bit about our integrated review, to outline in a little detail the chapter on the Indo-Pacific, which is clearly of most relevance today, and then maybe just some quick closing thoughts on why this focus on the Indo-Pacific and maybe some of the opportunities that arise from it. We've shared the link, as you mentioned, Michael, with you. I would encourage people, I don't always do this with British government documents, but I would encourage people to read the integrated review. It is an interesting document. I think for me, one of the most important sort of framing themes that I should set out here, just more generally across the integrated review, is the importance of some of the themes that have already arisen in other speakers' comments about the way that the international environment is changing, and therefore the way that the UK needs to change its approach to pursuing its international interests, particularly issues around perhaps a more fragmented international system and that sense of intensifying competition that every speaker I think so far has mentioned. And therefore maybe that the UK needs to be a little bit more flexible or indeed dynamic in our approach, and that's across all issues, not just the integrated review. It sets out in its sort of opening comments 4 overarching trends that will be of importance to the UK. And I think I'll outline these because I think they get really to the question that we're trying to address today, which is why should we be focusing on the Indo-Pacific? And the 4, again, they're not things that will surprise anybody, but the 4 are the sort of geopolitical and geo-economic shifts that we're seeing and that others have noticed. The integrated review notes specifically China's growing weight in the international system, but it also raises very specifically the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific, both for global prosperity and for global security. And it touches on things like the emergence of new markets and the growth of the global middle class, where obviously countries like India are also going to be very, very important. The second of the 4 trends is the one that we've all noted, that is the increase in systemic competition, that intensification of competition between states, and perhaps, and this is something that the integrated review points out, how that is manifesting in a competition or a contest over international rules and norms. If you read the integrated review, you will note, and this is the 3rd overarching trend, a very strong focus on technological change and the importance of science and technology. Clearly, technological developments, digitalization, these are reshaping our societies, they're reshaping our economies. And clearly there are huge benefits here that we should be seeking to deliver to the global citizens. But at the same time, it's also clearly one of those areas of intensifying systemic competition. And the integrated review and some of the developments within the UK and some of the structural changes that we're making in our systems speak to that a little bit. And then finally, and again, not in any way a new innovation, but the 4th trend is that continuing importance of transnational challenges, things like climate change, also obviously as we are in the middle of the global COVID pandemic, the risk of global health concerns, but also organised crime and terrorism. And the integrated review is very clear that this will require collective action, and increased multilateral cooperation to address these issues. So I've just outlined those a little bit because I think those do form the backdrop to why the integrated review focuses so clearly on the Indo-Pacific. It has a chapter all of its own within the integrated review, and it is very explicit that the UK will pursue what it calls deeper engagement in the Indo-Pacific. In doing that, the integrated review recognizes the importance of existing powers, obviously China, India, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. But it also talks about, as others have, the importance of close relationships with those existing institutions, particularly ASEAN, but also that the UK will seek accession to trade agreements like CPTPP as means to pursue this deeper engagement. Others have touched on all the reasons why the Indo-Pacific is important. I won't repeat those. I think, though, it is worth reminding ourselves that there is a degree of continuity in this interest. Velina, you mentioned an Indo-Pacific decade. We have, of course, talked about an Asia-Pacific century as well. And I think all of those amazing statistics, 40% of global GDP, half the population, these are things that we've focused on before, but are nonetheless still very, very important. I think we would add perhaps some of those new trends that show why we should be engaging on economic issues. Clearly, we've seen recently this region at the forefront of new global trade arrangements. I think you can say that the Indo-Pacific is very much at the heart of science and technological innovation, and some of the sharper-edged elements of that innovation. And of course, as others have mentioned, it is absolutely vital for if we want to construct resilient supply chains for all of Europe, that we focus on the Indo-Pacific region. For the UK specifically, it's 17.5% of our global trade, and it's 10% of our inward FDI, and we want to grow both of those figures. Again, others have touched on the security concerns. It is a centre of intensifying geopolitical competition, multiple flashpoints, unresolved territorial disputes. I think from the perspective of the integrated review, again, if you read it, you will see there's also clearly both a focus on the more traditional concerns, for instance, maritime security and freedom of navigation, but also some of those newer security challenges. And for instance, maybe the Indo-Pacific as front line on competition in cyberspace, for instance, and so needing to consider that broader range of issues as they apply to the region. What that means is we've identified 10 strands of priority work. I won't go through them all. I can come back in Q&A, but that includes our desire to join trade agreements, to have ASEAN dialogue partner status, to strengthen defence and security cooperation, and the integrated review talks of a more persistent presence, not yet permanent, but a persistent presence. And then other issues like cyber security and climate change as the issues that we really want to focus on. Just quickly, a couple of closing thoughts. Why the Indo-Pacific beyond those sort of statistical facts? I think it is fair to say, Velina, I think you alluded, and quite rightly, the UK has been slow to adopt this language. I think that possibly derives from a historical split within organisations like my own between South Asia and East Asia, and South Asia has quite a strong historical legacy for the UK's sort of foreign and security focus. Nonetheless, certainly within the FCDO, we see the Indo-Pacific as a useful framing device, not for all issues all of the time, but as a really powerful way of gaining insights on some of the issues that we are working on. Maybe if you invite a government official to speak at an event like this, we have a slightly more practical focus. But I was struck, for instance, the shift from, a very simple example, when you shift from talking about the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific, maritime security particularly on sea lanes of communication, becomes a very different subject. Asia-Pacific countries' maritime security doesn't stop at the western end of the Malacca Straits. It continues all the way through the Middle East, the Suez Canal. And so by focusing more broadly, you bring new insights, which you might not otherwise gain. And that has been very useful for the FCDO. And then my final set of comments, and I hope if you read the integrated review, you will see it. It is very clear on the importance of partnering. It is very clear that the UK alone cannot achieve the objectives that are set out in there, and that we want to both work with, but also, as the phrase is, co-creation with our allies and our partners in order to address the challenges that we set out and to deliver the objectives that we want to focus on. A good current example, HMS Queen Elizabeth, the UK's new aircraft carrier, is of course on its first overseas cruise. Obviously, we hope a very powerful symbol of the UK and its force projection, but I think it's really, really important to underline, as well as that, I think quite well-known US contingent on board. It has, for instance, a Dutch frigate accompanying it throughout its tour, and another good example of how I think we need to work collectively on these issues. I think there's a need for flexibility, back to my starting point on that new theme in the integrated review. We're seeing a lot of, I think the word is minilaterals. You've got the Quad, yes, but you've got sub-Quad groupings and you've got Quad plus groupings. And I think European countries need to think about how they can work flexibly to sort of engage with these groups on particular, often specific sectoral issues. I would also, in my final comment, say that I hope also that Asian countries, in creating those new flexible groupings, can keep them open. It's not necessarily a question of joining the Quad, but I think the collective shared interest that Europe and Asian countries have, that all of the speakers have so far identified, means it's really, really important that we don't close off cooperation mechanisms and that we are all able to join and share our experiences and our resources when we're addressing these really, really important issues. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sheckington, for your thoughts and your comments. If you allow me, I have probably identified two commonalities that all our speakers have pointed out so far. First of all, the change in identifying competition in the region, and second, that no country, no actor can deal with these challenges alone, that there is the call and apparently analyzing the strategic documents, also the clear setup towards more cooperation, towards more connectivity with actors between Europe, the European Union, and Asian countries and the Pacific countries. So thank you very much for giving us that insight from the UK's perspective. I would like to invite now Mr. MURANO also to give your comments and elaborations to what we have just heard before, and probably give also your outlook on how the Indo-Pacific region, from your perspective, will develop further after commenting on our two remarks.
Thank you very much. Again, I've already talked about almost 30 minutes, so I don't want to occupy the sessions. But I'd like to, after the listening to the two panelists, I'd like to address my findings and thoughts about the how do we address address to the Indo-Pacific cooperatively and collectively with Japan and other allies and partners. I think that in this discussions we have there are some positive trends and the negative trends. From the context of the positive trends, I can say that actually that the two panelists talked about from the European European Union perspective and UK's perspective, that both countries and the regional institutions has been already the focuses on the importance of the Indo-Pacific region from the context of the geopolitically and geoeconomically. But also that actually that in addition, not only just the political and economical attention to this region, but also a couple of the countries from Europe that has already deployed some actual presence, like the UK, the dispatch of the Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier, and the France and Germany, some other countries also deployed their actual assets. It is from the perspective of the security, the hard security issues. It is very effective to showing our collective willingness and resolve to maintain the stability, peace and stability of this region. This is the important point and positive trends. And also the secondary that it's also already the two panelists mentioned about that point, each countries, a couple of countries and also that European unions that has published and now established on their own the Indo-Pacific strategy / concept. So especially in the EU, of course that the integrated review, and also that EU's now that will publish on the coming autumn. Actually looking forward to publish on their own the Indo-Pacific strategy and concept. But at the same time, that we needed to, I think that we needed to consider about challenges or the negative trends. The first is it is related on each other. First is the limitation of resources. After the COVID-19 pandemics, the economies basically they downturned, and our defense budget and the security-related budgets cannot drastically increase. If we want to do so, but the political reality, it is hard to do so. So under the resource constraints or budget constraints, our challenge is how do we more effectively coordinate with not only just one countries, but also coordinate with each other to promoting to those kind of the activities and the policies in this region. It is related on the resource constraints. We also have faced to a lot of and the variety of challenges, broader challenges. For instance, according to the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance and the U.S.-Japan joint statement by the President Biden and the Prime Minister Suga, both countries that tried to deal with very broad range of issues, such as defense and traditional defense issues, the economies, technology, advanced technologies, the global health, and climate change or climate crisis, and the values and principle related issues like democracies. They are all recognized as security agenda. However, the expanding the security, the agenda or security issues, is in the context of the time and the resource constraints, bring trade-off that complicate policy prioritization. So what I want to say that of course that we we already understood the importance of the broader integration of the broader context or broader factors, not only the traditional security issues, but also some geoeconomics and so on. But if we gathered those kind of issues as a security issues, that our policy prioritization under the resource constraints is going to be more difficult. So we have no choice to some kind of the harder choice for the prioritization issues. So in that reason, that I would like to maybe that we need to shares the priorities or findings and identifying our priority gaps or resource gaps. So and after that, we need to discuss further to how do we adjusting our prioritization gap, or we need to coordinate with our ways and means to address the maintain the peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's my current thoughts and observation on the initial remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Murano. Thank you very much for your comments. I see that we have approximately half an hour, 40 minutes left for a discussion, and I'd like to invite our speakers at this point also to ask questions to each other, to make comments to the remarks that have been mentioned before. And I would like to start by addressing two questions, one for Velina Chakarova and one for Dr. SECKINGTON, reflecting on what we have heard before. First of all, Velina Chakarova, probably to have a short perspective on the future challenges. I would be most interested in your future analysis, an outlook of the importance, the developments in the entire Indo-Pacific region in the future. Basically, if we would be having this discussion 3 years from now, what would be different? We're talking about these changes and the intensifying competition in the region between global powers. Most of them have been mentioned already. But if we have this discussion in a couple of years, how would we talk about the Indo-Pacific in a different way?
Of course, speaking of the future of the Indo-Pacific region is quite of a tricky exercise, as there will be no reason for much of optimism because of the current transitionary period in the global affairs. I mean, if you want me to present you a realistic picture, I don't have much of a good news, so to say, which is why we are having this kind of discussions, because we need to come up with some solutions how to prevent certain scenarios from happening. One of the scenarios I see happening, if this transitionary period in the global affairs continues, is this kind of bilateralization of international relations. Every country for itself, all middle-sized powers trying to come up with an approach how to not take sides in the systemic rivalry between United States and China, or if they have to take sides, as it is the case, for instance, with the closest partners of the one or the other, then, of course, to not get entangled, to not get caught in the competition, in the confrontation. Of course, the worst case scenario would be a direct confrontation, not necessarily only between the United States and China, which I don't foresee, but increased tensions in the Indo-Pacific, for instance, between China and India, is very much on the table. So one of my anticipations for the next 3 to 5 years, if we are speaking about a middle middle term window of time window and window of opportunities, how to prevent this kind of tensions from happening. And of course, this will be not the only area, a geographic area or territorial disputes that will or might witness an increased amount of tensions. Let's look at the Southeast Asia, and once again, we could for sure anticipate further tensions between China on the one side and other direct neighbors because of direct territorial disputes or other trades, for instance, trade issues. So, of course, the idea is, and I think the timing is more than right, to come together, and that means, of course, specifically for all these middle-sized powers, regional actors in the Indo-Pacific, to come together and discuss openly about the worst-case scenarios and how to prevent them from happening. And one of the ways how we can do it is actually to engage more actively in various formats. So we are already observing this reality on the ground. Let's take the example of the quadrilateral format between United States, India, Australia, and Japan. Then again, we see that France has initiated something similar together with Australia and India, a trilateral format. Then again, the European Union is now actively engaging with the ASEAN countries and with individual key players in the Indo-Pacific. So you are quite already observing this reality of ad hoc, what I call ad hoc fluid geopolitical and geoeconomic formations based on trade, investment, soft issues, and so on. So this is one way how to actually avoid worst case scenario. Of course, another way how to avoid it is by engaging and strengthening the multilateral institutions. We do not want to see a scenario where we end up with two parallel institutional universes, where on the one side we have China, which is pushing towards concrete alternative institutions, trade blocs, partnerships, and then again, of course, what we are going to observe as a direct reaction to it is the transatlantic alliance, together with like-minded partners and countries in the Indo-Pacific, trying to push towards an alternative regional formation. And of course, there have been speculation about this so-called Asian NATO, which I don't see happening, but we can take the context of an Asian NATO into consideration, and there you go. Once again, we see this kind of bifurcation of the global system, which I think will lead to further tensions, conflicts of military or non-military nature along the peripheries and along of points of intersection. And all of this is not in our interest. Not in the interest of European partners, and certainly not in the interest of Indo-Pacific countries. So how to avoid it? Of course, on the one side, and this is the European approach, we do not want to exclude China. We do realize that China is part of the problem, but also part of the solution. So that's why we have also introduced this threefold approach towards China. But on the other side, we want to strengthen. We want to strengthen and promote and invest in ties with the other Indo-Pacific countries, so that we build a solid counterweight, not of a military nature, but of any other comprehensive kind of nature, to help them tackle the potential risks and issues I've named.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Velina Chakarova, for not only outlining future challenges that might arise within the next couple of years regarding the Indo-Pacific rivalries that we see on a geostrategic level, but also pointing out potential ways of avoiding those worst case scenarios that you have mentioned by enhancing bilateral formats of cooperation in particular. I would like to ask also one question to Dr. Seckington. You have mentioned before also the importance of science and technology, of also enhancing cooperation formats in this area. Benefits and challenges certainly, as you've mentioned, arise in this field. And you have very shortly pointed out also issues related to cyber and cybersecurity. Since we have also heard from Ms. Chakarova that China and the US might not go into an open conflict, into a traditional one, which I do agree as well. Probably we see, however, a more hybrid way of competition between those two actors, of course, also involving or taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. So against this background, can you, Mr. Seckington, mention shortly also the importance of cybersecurity, of challenges in a more hybrid threat area that also affect the stability of the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you, Michael. I'll try and share some thoughts. If I might take a small liberty and just slightly expand it to slightly develop my own points on the broader science and technology issue, which, as I mentioned, I think features very strongly in the integrated review. But on the point of cyber and cybersecurity, clearly this is an area, as you say, grey zone, hybrid, where it overlaps with so many different areas, and maybe comes back to Murano Sensei's comment about hard choices because we're trying to do everything. But actually, when one comes to sort of cyber issues, the reality might be that it's there in almost everything that we do, in the sense that we are, of course, a connected world, even if I can't turn my camera on. But joking aside, I think it's a real challenge, and it gets to quite a number of the sort of security issues that we've been trying to deal with in terms of the development by some countries of niche capabilities that allow them to gain an advantage even when they may not have the preponderance in more conventional formats. Obviously, there are elements here around intellectual property theft. There are elements around serious organized crime. So addressing these issues and ensuring that affected countries and indeed unaffected countries have the right capabilities is something that the UK is very, very strongly invested in. And I think, I'm certainly not going to single countries out, but the situation across the Indo-Pacific is clearly quite mixed in that regard. And so I think there is a piece here which we need to work to ensure that where cyber becomes a security issue for partners in the region, we are there and supporting and able to build capacity. I think it gets to the broader point that I'd like to just reinforce on science and technology, which, there's a lot being said, I think, and it's being swept up in a lot of debates around economic security as well, which clearly, I think, have grown in significance, certainly in the UK, but I would say also in Japan over the last 2 to 3 years. And this is part of the conversation that the UK is having with a number of countries. And here again, you get to a whole range of issues. But I think some of the things that we do need to think about, and I get to Velina's comments perhaps on different international systems, the issues of standards. As if one views the region, and I think it's right to view it as a sort of hub really for a lot of science innovation, the setting of standards for new technologies will become something that I think already really is quite contested, but will become even more so. The example that we sometimes give is facial recognition technology, for instance, and the potential uses that might be put to. So really serious challenges around ensuring that the values that our countries, I think I can say it for all of us, that embrace are not being affected by the sort of technical developments and the setting of standards that accompanies that. Cyber's definitely a part of that, but I would say it's not a small part of that, it's a large part of that, but it's not the only part of that. So I think there's quite a broad brush set of issues. If I can give one direct example from recent work, I think it was connected cities was one sort of area, and it sounds great, and it is great. But as soon as you start digging gently into that, you realise that some of the sort of technologies and the standards that are being promoted around that might be quite challenging for some of us in terms of the uses that they might be put to. So I think there's a broad set of issues here. It relates definitely to the sort of multiple international systems point, but I think it also it does. If I can sort of, you asked us to pose questions, I do accept Morano Sensei's comments that there are hard choices here, but I think the real challenge that I think we all face at the moment is that as soon as you start to scratch the surface on many of these issues, the interconnected nature of the world and China's centrality in that means that it's really, really hard to unpick any one issue and separate it out. I'd welcome, as a government official, thoughts on how that might be done.
Thank you very much for also managing to portray the larger picture and what is at stake here when we also talk about cybersecurity, but pointing out at the very end of your remarks now the issue regarding interconnectivity. I fully agree with you that we have to consider that the world is growing smaller and that different areas that we are moving in politically, economically, socially are getting more and more interconnected. And of course, I don't think that there is an easy answer for that issue, for that question at stake. I just saw that we have received a very good question also from our live chat on YouTube, specifically pointing out, Velina Chakarova, to your remarks earlier. You have mentioned that all actors in Europe are pulling together now for the first time. To what extent do smaller or medium-sized European countries identify national interests in the Indo-Pacific, and how can, for example, Austria contribute here to the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think that I've outlined the Austrian approach quite extensively, so I don't want to repeat myself. The most important message is that middle, small-sized European member states do not have really the saying in global affairs if they want to act in an individual manner. The only way how they actually can produce a meaningful response to certain international or regional trends and challenges is the way, as I outlined it, to use the institutional approach by the European Union, which is why it is so important to have also a strategy adopted and improved by 27 members, as I outlined, the strategy from April this year. And I see that this is going to be the way specifically for middle and small-sized member states to try to shape the process and the future debate within the European institutions. In a sense, they will reflect, of course, their own interests, but none of these countries can have a serious stake or serious impact on the centrifugal forces and systemic processes that are taking place right now in the Indo-Pacific if they do not act collectively, if they do not actually, as I said, pull together in one and the same direction, of course, based on a common denominator. The second point is where we can have a strong position is that currently the European Union, and hopefully now with the new US administration, once again we will have a strong American position on that matter. But as you know, the European Union has been this lonely international actor, more or less, during the previous administration that has been trying to promote and strengthen multilateralism. That means, of course, all these kind of rules, norms, standards of international behavior that has emerged has been developed, has been shaped for the last 75 years. And of course, it is what I said also previously in our common interest that we act collectively on that matter, because more or less now there is also, let's put it very openly, there is also an alternative, there are also alternative ideas about the way how the global order can be shaped in the field of international law or in the field of international standards. And of course, here I have an open question mark for all of us, because none has the answer. And that is that we are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. And we know from the previous industrial revolutions that took place during the 70s was the third one. And previously, of course, during the time when Britain became this great power, these were the technological revolutions that enabled a power, a nation state, to become a global power. Now, knowing that we don't have a clear winner of the fourth industrial revolution, we should be also preparing for the final outcome of it, which means that the power that will become victorious, that will emerge as a victor out of the industrial revolution, out of this digitalization, will be also the power that will impose its own view, image of the global norms, standards, and rules of behavior. And of course, it is in our interest to prepare for this final outcome. That means that we should start doing our homework now. We should start actually preparing for a situation in which, as I said, the worst case scenario would be kind of a systemic bipolarization in which we would have two different networks. I mean, this kind of decoupling that has taken place during the last administration was not a single act. It is also in China's interest to decouple from US-led networks and actually create, strengthen, and push forward its own networks in all relevant fields. So what I'm trying to say is that all states in Europe, big or small, are in fact small in the global context or in the context of Indo-Pacific region, but the small size countries, they have to actually come together and present a collective approach. Otherwise, they will not be able to make any difference.
Thank you very much, Velina Chakarova, for these outlines and also presenting a way forward for small and middle-sized European countries that is only towards a more collective, more shared approach. We have now approximately 15 minutes left before we will have the honor to hear Dr. FASSLABEND's final remarks. And I would like to invite the three speakers to give your final comments, your final remarks on this issue right now, to probably present also solutions and outlooks. And I would like to start with Mr. MURANO with his final remarks. Probably also one additional small question that would be of keen interest to me personally is if you see any reason and any foreseeable scenario, future scenario, where the Quad would also extend and its scope, inviting probably also other countries like the UK or the European countries. But please, Mr. MURANO, give us your final remarks on these issues.
Again, thank you very much for inviting me and giving an opportunity to discussing the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific issues here. As the last comment of this panel, at first that I fully agree with the idea of the more open and frank discussion among many countries to prevent crisis or contingencies from happening in the next 3 to 5 years. And I believe that the think tank community as well as the governments. Each government will play an important role to host some track 2 or track 1.5 dialogues, and to invite some other more sensitive countries and partners to invite this kind of discussion. And on the other hand, in addition, I think that we also need to consider about what happens after deterrence fails and a crisis or war occurs. The context of in Indo-Pacific, the worst example of the Taiwan. But the reason I've been thinking about this lately is because, as I've mentioned several times before, the relationship between Russia and the rest of the world that has continued even after the Crimea crisis in 2014. So that is my origin of my questions. Why we didn't consider about those kind of possibility. So what happens to the relationships after the crisis or limited war? That depends on some specific scenario, how the crisis begins. But I think that the Western countries there has done a lot of thinking about how crisis or how contingencies will occur. But the relatively little discussion about how to terminate or how to de-escalate or off-ramping the situation once war starts. So in that context, I already comparing the situation in the security environment in Indo-Pacific region, between the Indo-Pacific and the Europe. But we already faced the similar environment and experience. So in that sense, I would like to emphasize again the importance of the shares and the open discussion about the experience, our knowledge of those kind of similar gray zone crisis or some contingency, because obviously no one's at least I've not expected until 2014 that the Russian invaded to the Crimea. So we needed to think about think about unthinkable things. So that's my final thought, and including to the more broader range of countries, not only the existed framework like a bilateral relationship or multilateral allies and the Quad or G7 or G20s, that we can invite a lot of countries to more frankly discussing about those kind of the possibilities. So thank you very much for attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murano, for your excellent presentation at the beginning, and now also for your perfect remarks, the discussion that you have also enabled. I would now like to invite Mr. SECKINGTON for your final remarks from your perspective, also probably reflecting a little bit again what has been said before, or also giving us an outlook on how you would identify the future in regards to the Indo-Pacific, especially from a security perspective. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you, Michael. I would, on that latter point, share the very realistic assessment of Velina. It's very hard to see anything moving significantly in the short term, over 3 years. I think the difficult sort of points of tension will continue. The competition between the US and China, I think maybe the slightly more sort of engagement focused approach of the new US administration, I'm sure can only help to a certain extent and can help address some of the very worst tensions. But I really don't see the actual issues going away. And so I think I see a risk of continuing sort of concerns, tensions, and therefore security-based responses, including around defence equipment purchases, etc., which sort of, without going into a spiral necessarily, do of course, increase risk. So I think we are in a very challenging situation, and that will be the case for the immediate future. I think that's a bit gloomy, but I think in terms of looking forwards, what might we do? I'd focus on the word capabilities, maybe, and capabilities in two ways. That question about what EU medium-sized states can do, and your answer, Velina, I thought was absolutely spot on. I mean, if I may, and from the UK perspective, I genuinely mean this. I mean, the EU has immense strengths vis-a-vis Asia and the Indo-Pacific. This event itself, I think, is exactly what I mean when I talk about building of capabilities. In my work as a member of the research cadre, used to regularly attend the EU-China academic network, which allowed us to engage universities across Europe with great experience, both of China but also of Asia more widely. And there are huge resources and skills across Europe, which I think are very, very important. And I think it is the case that many of us are sort of at best almost going back to Asia. We of course have good relations there, but what we're talking about is an intensification of those relationships and both a broadening and a deepening of relationships to cover many more issues. And I think to support that, building our capabilities, our understanding is absolutely essential, and doing that collectively, because that's what the only way we're going to come to shared understanding is the basis then for collaboration. I'd also, if I may say, I think capabilities, I have a different sort of perspective of it also, a very positive one from my time working in Tokyo, if I may. I led the foreign and security policy team in the British Embassy in Tokyo, and I was consistently, yes, I can use the word surprised at just the depth and range of what we were trying to do with Japan and what we were succeeding in doing with Japan. And I think underpinning our ability to work with not just Japan but countries in Asia in a very practical way is also very important. That can mean different things, linguistic skills, for instance, but also deepening our understanding and our connections through our different security apparatus, security advisors, etc. This is how I think you will then really build the ability to engage effectively. So I agree it's important, for instance, that ship deployments show resolve, but I think I would also underline that one of the key outcomes of Royal Naval deployments over the last 5 or 6 years has been to build our capability to work not just with Japan but with other countries through joint exercises. And so while that's not necessarily about preparing for war, that is preparing to cooperate, even on humanitarian issues. So I think there are a set of issues for me about capabilities, strengthening those both within Europe, through working together and sharing our understandings, but then also building on that to reach out to key partners in the region and building the mechanisms that will allow us to effectively engage and deliver on those objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian Seckington, also for your outlook, although it was indeed a little bit gloomy. However, I believe that we can agree that the challenges that were mentioned today are going to stay, and it is quite remarkable and relevant that we have a common ground between all three speakers. Everyone has mentioned this from an Austrian European, from the UK, but also from a Japanese perspective, that the future is continuing to stay challenging, to stay very interconnected in areas, the fields where these challenges are taking place, and that it is basically depending on us, on the cooperation between different state formats on a bilateral, on a multilateral level to cope with these challenges. Having said this, I would like to invite also, of course, Velina TCHAKAROVA for your final remarks. Velina, you have the final word.
Well, on my side, I think that the very fact that now the European Union, the member states have recognized the geopolitical significance of the Indo-Pacific region is already a great win. That means we have a basis, we have a common ground, we can start building up on that matter. The Indo-Pacific, from a European perspective, is spanning from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states. Is going to be this one region where the European Union will be enjoying a broad and comprehensive relationships with many partners. And of course, India and Japan will be absolutely at the forefront. And on the other side, of course, the relationship with China will be further shaped, and not to forget that European Union US relations will be further deepened and developed. So any blockades, any tensions along the maritime routes in the Indo-Pacific region will have devastating effect on the European trade flows, on the European stability and prosperity in the long term. Thus, it is in the common interest of Europe, both institutions, member states, to maintain secure, stable, and predictable maritime routes in this region. And of course, I expect that further relationships with some of the countries that I've named will be deepened in order to create a counterweight to China's overwhelming presence in South and Southeast Asia. Now, I recommend facilitating a process of basic ground rules to foster a successful reorganization of the supply chains within the Indo-Pacific region towards Europe and vice versa. This is a must, in my view, and it will include also partners. So I see that also Great Britain and Europe can once again find a common ground to cooperate. This will require a lot of flexibility, a lot of also openness and long-term vision about the future of these two broad regions. So an active engagement, investments in maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region are an absolute must. Once again, they are necessary to guarantee the security of the Indo-Pacific supply chains, to enable free flows of trade, energy, services, capital, data. And here, once again, I see a very strong role for Japan and for the future relations between the European Union and Japan because of all the knowledge, expertise, know-how in the field of connectivity. And let's not forget that this time, there can be also a collective winner out of the fourth industrial revolution. And that can be a collective effort to actually merge efforts and strengthen cooperations in the digitalization era. And finally, changing the narrative in Europe on both institutional and national level regarding the future of the Indo-Pacific is definitely a great advantage that will bring us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Velina Chakarova. I think this was the perfect and very elaborate roundup to give us a perspective on what is important in the future, to also consider this long-term perspective vis-a-vis the region. So I believe this is the perfect way to wrap up as well our 2-hour session. And without further ado, I would like to thank everyone again for listening, especially our 3 speakers, Mr. Murano, Masashi, Mr. Ian SECKINGTON, and Velina Chakarova for their very profound input, for allowing us to get a very good and detailed perspective on the challenges and also the opportunities that the region has to offer. So it is my great honor now to present Dr. Werner FASSLABEND, our last speaker. He is the former Austrian Minister of Defense and also the president of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. Thank you very much, Dr. FASSLABEND, for being with us and for giving us also your perspectives, your final remarks on what has been said to wrap up this session most perfectly. I hand over the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. First and foremost of all, I want to thank our speakers. It is certainly a big step forward when a landlocked country like Austria is going together, discussing together with most important maritime power in Europe and somebody from the most important maritime power of Asia, the question of Indo-Pacific. We have to be aware that the notion still is pretty new. As a matter of fact, you know, it's around about 1 decade old. And for quite some years, we even thought that it was invented in our institute, until we realized that it was also in some American think tanks already usual to talk about the Indo-Pacific region. And the reason why for our institute to occupy ourselves with the Indo-Pacific was just this tremendous increase of importance of this region. I usually called it, you know, it's the new Mare Nostrum. Probably most people know that in ancient times, the Mediterranean used to be the Mare Nostrum between Europe and Africa and Western Asian regions. And then in modern times, it's changed and the Atlantic became more or less the central maritime region of the globe. In the 21st century, it certainly became the Indo-Pacific, not the Pacific and not the Indian Ocean, but the Indo-Pacific. And it's quite interesting that up to now, I still can read so many definitions about the size or about what this region really is comprehending. Without any doubt, it's the region between the African West Coast and the whole Indian Ocean and at least the Western Pacific area. Whether it really goes back also to the Eastern American coast, you can discuss about it. But certainly, it has become the central maritime region of the world, the central basin. And this is so important because, I mean, after this simple rule, 70, 80, 90%, 70% of the world is covered by water, by sea. Around about 80% of the globe's population are living within the reach of around about 100 miles from the seaside, and 90% of global trade goes by sea. And therefore, this maritime region has become certainly the center of global interest for the future. This is due to the demographic development on the one hand, but also, of course, this enormous rise of China. Admirable rise. Nobody had expected it before. And this certainly has become a game changer. And insofar, we have to occupy ourselves with the region as such, but also with this new situation that brought the change from a more or less terrestrial orientation in China to a seaside, to a maritime orientation, and also this rise to become world's biggest trading nation has brought so many challenges for all of us. And first of all, I would like to say, of course, it's the good right of China to safeguard and to secure its own interests as the most important world trading power, for sure. But at the same time, I also would say this must not be at the cost of others, whether this is Japan or South Korea or the ASEAN countries or India. And certainly the claim in South China Sea makes quite some difference. not only for the neighboring countries, but for everybody, because free navigation is something that is in the interest of everybody in the world. And at the same time, also the connectivity. And if you just look to the situation that so many cables in the world go through the middle of the South China Sea, you can see that the control of connectivity certainly will be one of the big questions of the future. At the other hand, also if you look, to the map, you can see that, the Pakistan corridor and the Myanmar corridor, of course, are also changing the geostrategic situation in Asia, at least between China and India, in a way that did not happen before. And insofar, it is the big game changer. So, what can we do? Of course, this new situation does mean for all of us that the new central maritime region of the world is not a matter and a case just for one nation, and not a case and a matter for the two biggest nations, but because it's the central region, the central basin of the world, it is a matter for the whole globe, for the Europeans in a similar way as for the Asians or the Africans or also the Americans. Having said this means that we have to discuss it. We have to discuss the future order, the changes, the dangers, what will come up, and also try to set red lines, not just by showing military strength, but by having a dialogue with all the partners. This will be very important, Everybody can learn, and everybody also has to accept positions from other side, if he wants or not, because otherwise the reactions will come. And insofar, this function as the central global basin means that there is a common global interest in the stability, in peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region, because this means strong consequences, not only for economy, but also for prosperity of the world. And insofar, we have to look at it, try not to establish a two-world approach for the future, but fight for freedom and for a rule and value-based system for this central region. And insofar, I only can say, I look at this discussion as one of the first discussions in a long row. I'm completely convinced that we will have to continue our presentations and discussions in the ongoing situation. And I only can say that development seems to be very fast from all sides. Mm-hmm. And insofar, I think we will not have so much time just to develop concepts or whatever. We have to go immediately into the matter. We have to try, to occupy ourselves intensively. And we have to try to do it in a way that at the end there is a more stable, a more secure, and also a more free globe, free for everybody in the world. And insofar, I want to thank once again all the participants, not only our speakers, especially also Japanese ambassador and the embassy for co-organizing it together with us. I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the future. Thank you, and I hand over for last words to Michael, and I want to thank him especially for moderating this session.
Thank you very much, Dr. FASSLABEND. I totally share your conviction that this hopefully will be the start of intensified future discussions on the topic and other topics of mutual interest to Japan, to Austria, to the European Union. The need to discuss, the need for future intensified dialogue has been met already during this discussion, during this format. And having said this, I would like to thank also from my perspective the Japanese Embassy, His Excellency Ambassador MIZUTANI, for the cooperation. We are very much looking forward to engaging in other formats in the future as well, hopefully in person. And of course, thanking all speakers for sharing their profound expertise with us today. Honoring the Japanese and the Austrian precision, I'm also happy to announce that we're finishing right on time. Thank you very much to all our viewers. It was a pleasure, and we're looking forward to welcoming you again. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye to everybody.